Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Driscoll. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in early modern Italian literature and cultural studies at Freie Universitat Berlin.
And I'm Kristen Keach, a PhD candidate in the Italian Studies Department at UC Berkeley. We're really excited to discuss Dante's Purgatorio, Canto 29, and the spectacular pageant, the procession of the church triumphant, which the pilgrim poet witnesses in the earthly paradise.
Yes, and so today we have a lot to share and a lot to discuss regarding how the senses in particular are at play in this canto and what its visual and sonic elements have to teach us, not only about how Dante travels to paradise, but how the reader gets to accompany him on that journey.
Absolutely. So let's begin with a quick overview of what occurs in the 29th canto of Purgatory. And given just how visual this canto is, it's really appropriate to use images to discuss how the episode evolves. So let's start with a modern interpretation of how we arrived in the earthly paradise. Sandow Burke here shows the new space Dante and Virgil have now reached. In Canto 27, Dante crosses the wall of fire on the terrace of lust, and thus he completes the penitential process up the mountain. This, of course, means that he can now enter the earthly paradise, rendered here by Burke as a hospitable locale. But while Virgil leads the pilgrim poet and the reader to assume that we will now meet Beatrice in Canto 28, we'll linger a little bit longer with the nymph Matilda, who both is introduced by and is shown here in the act of picking flowers.
Exactly. And it's really helpful to have Flaxman's illustration there because it brings out the comparison that Dante makes in Canto 28 between Matilda and Persephone, two women who wander throughout gardens as they collect flowers. And indeed, Matilda is a figure who has many different sister doubles. She is, of course, the embodiment of Leah, the biblical representative of the active life about whom Dante had dreamt in Canto 27. But what makes Matilda a particularly unique and indeed important character is that she is the undeniable expert. She's our tour guide par excellence of this Divina Foresta, and she's the one who teaches Dante about the earthly paradise, how its nature operates, and prepares both him and the reader for the arrival of Beatrice in the next canto in Purgatory 30, who will then take over as the instructor and the guide in the next canto.
Right. And while Matilda leads us through the visual moments in this canto, she's also leading us through the sonic ones as well. So maybe we can take a moment to think about why Matilda is singing in the garden and the role of sound more broadly as it functions in Purgatory.
Absolutely. So if we take stock of where we are sonically in the poem, we can say that we are immersed in a dramatically different soundscape from the screams, the shrieks, the howls, the cries, and the overall very nasty sounds that we just heard in Inferno. So unlike Hell, Purgatory instrumentalizes song as a pedagogical tool that teaches against sin and leads to the purification of the soul. And this is why time and time again, the second part of Dante's journey illustrates how and why the spiritual effects of music depend on the listener's way of experiencing music. The representation of song, in other words, is rarely, if ever, about who performs music and what the lyrics are that they're singing, but how the music falls upon the listener's ear and what lessons the listener can take away from that musical experience.
And really, ever since the beginning of Purgatory, Dante has been faced with the task of distinguishing the sirenic songs of terrestrial desire that seek to delay and distract him from the songs of penitence and the chants of divine praise that will propel his journey forward.
Absolutely. So as a whole, we could say that Purgatory advances throughout as this kind of sonic pageant, a key word that we'll come back to, of the tensions between beautifully misguiding music and salvifically cleansing music. This is why all along the way, as we experience these lessons in ear training alongside Dante, we witness how Purgatory literally progresses canto per canto from songs of individual purgation and sometimes of distraction towards those of communal rejoicing.
Right, nice. And here in 29 too, we should note that this is the only canto that begins with the word cantando and is the single instance in the Commedia where a canto begins with a variant of the word cantare. So it's pretty interesting how Dante introduces Matilda by way of not only what she sings, but how she communicates via song.
Exactly. And this is why Dante draws our immediate attention to both the style and the content of Matilda's song at the outset of the episode, where he writes, Cantando come donna innamorata, continuò col fin di sue parole. Beati quorum tecta sunt peccata. The final line meaning, blessed are those whose sins have been covered, whose sins have been forgiven. And this is the melodic announcement that Matilda makes to the souls that have completed their purgation.
And here I'll note too that we have both thematic and sonic momentum that steers individual mourning and penitence towards collective joy. And eventually for Dante, we'll see a happy reunion with Beatrice.
Absolutely. And so with Matilda's song, we have a performer of the sensuous, amorous style. This is a woman who sings like a lady in love, but she issues forth the lyrics and the lessons of Psalm 31, which pronounces blessed the souls that have been fully cleansed of sin. And so as a kind of accompaniment to the physical arrival at the earthly paradise, Matilda's art of song is that which marks the end of one phase of the pilgrim's journey and the beginning now of a new one.
So, speaking of beginnings and endings, we should also think about that the canto itself is measured by a beginning that starts with music and an ending that concludes with sound, that being the thunder that brings the procession to a halt, which also recalls the lightning that Dante thought he saw at the beginning of the canto, tying the two ends of the canto together.
Right. And so we can say that by punctuating Canto 29 in this way, Dante's references to music and sound both operate as a kind of increasing tempo and acceleration for narrative, thematic, and spiritual progress.
Let's remember, too, that throughout this episode, we have many other musical moments. Dante makes an invocation to the Holy Muses, O Sacrosante Vergini, and we hear the bearers of the candelabra singing Hosanna. And peppered throughout are lots of other songs and sounds that contrast with the melodies of grief and penitence we heard as we were making our way up the mountain. But for all of the noise in the Garden of Eden, I couldn't help but notice the absence of sound from Statius, who joins with Dante on the journey in Canto 21, but more so the fact that Virgil doesn't say anything in this canto. And in fact, this becomes even more apparent if we return to the visual iconography for Purgatorio Canto 29, in which most artists choose not to include Virgil in their visual representations. And in fact, as we see in the Vellutello image, Virgil seems to be visually replaced by Statius.
Right, exactly. In that detail, we can see the letters M, S, and D above three figures. There's no V. We don't see Virgil. So to pick up on your point about how Virgil doesn't say anything, it's interesting because he's proving himself to be a man of his word. Because back in Canto 27, let's remember that he said, non aspettarmi udir più. And that's what he does. He doesn't tell us anything else. That's his last utterance in the poem. Even if, though, just as Beatrice tells Dante in the next canto that Virgil has left them, his intertextual voice, the voice of Virgil's poetry, gets to linger even after his physical presence is no longer with this company.
Right. So Virgil remains as a figural part of this community in the earthly paradise, even if we see and hear less of him. Not only do we not get Virgil's voice here, but the facial recognition of Virgil is slowly replaced with other images. After the procession begins, Dante marvels at how the flaming candelabra paint the sky red, and he looks to Virgil to see his reaction, noting, Io mi rivolsi d'ammirazione pieno al buon Virgilio, ed esso mi rispose con vista carica di stupor non meno, indi rende l'aspetto all'alte cose che si moviano incontro a noi si tardi, che foram vinte da novelle spose. So as we see, Virgil isn't granted a verbal response here, and we only know what his face looks like, and that's only because we know that it looks like Dante's.
Right. We only get a glimpse of what Virgil's reaction is because Dante first describes his own, and all of this contributes to, exactly as you're saying, the fading of Virgil in terms of how much attention Dante gives him at this point of the poem.
And I'm really struck thinking about how Dante will, in just one canto, repeat this act of turning around only to find that Virgil is no longer with them. So it seems this scene here where the readers are made aware of Virgil's lack of participation, especially with regard to his vocal participation, prepares us for when Beatrice tells Dante that Virgil has left.
Exactly. So I think that this point allows us to think also a little bit more critically about the interplay between sound and image in the poem. And if we go back to the first words that Matilda speaks to Dante in line 15, she says, "Frate mio, guarda e ascolta." And here she's referring to the pageant that is slowly advancing towards them, but she's also uniting the faculties of sight and hearing as the interpretive key to our unlocking and navigating of the text as readers. But we should keep in mind that guardare and ascoltare work together in sometimes really complex ways in this canto. So for example, we have instances where sound operates as a preamble to vision in that voices are heard before images appear. And this can sometimes lead to surprising or incongruous corollaries between sound and image, which often occurs in this canto, especially in the scene of the procession.
I completely agree with you, Kate, and I think that the choice of having Matilda speak in the imperative, guarda e ascolta, really underscores this point. Looking and listening are not passive actions for Dante as he experiences the procession. But what is striking is how Dante transforms the experience of witnessing the parade into a communal one, where the singular command reaches an entire community of readers, an act that breaks the divide between the private and public. Just as Dante and his contemporaries would have done while viewing a live-action street or festival pageant in Florence, the figures of the poem lend their attention to the unbreakable bond between guardare and ascoltare in this triumphant spectacle.
Right. So to balance this bond, since we have already said a little bit about the sonic dimension, let's shift to a more visual key and talk about what exactly is included in this grand pageant, this procession of the Church Triumphant, and discuss a little how did artists seek to represent this episode visually?
Absolutely. So what are some of the things we see in the procession? As Dante describes, we first encounter 7 candelabra carried by nymphs, which represent the sevenfold Spirit of God or the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. Then will come 24 elders walking 2 by 2, who represent the books of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. They'll be followed by 4 animals who represent the symbols of the evangelists and their corresponding gospels: Matthew the man, Mark the lion, Luke the ox, and John the eagle. Following them will be a 2-wheeled gold chariot pulled by a griffin, signaling the duality of Christ as both human and divine. On either side of the chariot will be 2 groups of 3 and 4 women dancing, one being the theological virtues and the other the cardinal virtues. And finally, we have 7 men trailing behind, who are the authors of the epistles, the Acts, and the Apocalypse, or parts of the New Testament. The whole pageant takes the form of the crucifix, or the symbol upon which the life of Christ on earth ended, but which represents eternal life after death.
Yeah, that's great. Those are such great visual aids. So from what you're saying and from what you're showing, this is a pretty allegorically charged parade, and we're meant to understand it as such if we want to stay with Dante and really understand where we're going in the next canticle.
Yeah, and we can think too about how it is staged both in Dante's text and in some of the visual representations. We should remember that the river Lethe separates the pilgrim poet, Matilda, Statius, and Virgil from the pageant. And so the viewing experience becomes doubled because Dante can see directly across the river, but also views the different figures reflected in the river. And William Blake's watercolor painting really encapsulates that spirit, where he shows Dante standing on the riverbank's edge, looking directly across, but also has the flames of the candelabra painted both in the sky and in the river itself, showing the duality of vision, but as well trying to use the medium of watercolor to blur in the sonic and the visual in his one depiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Blake watercolor is perfect. And I love your visual analysis of it because it also brings out then how the ecosystem of the earthly paradise plays a really important part here in meaning making. It's almost as if here in Blake's River, as in Dante's River, we see it as a kind of pastoral proscenium, or a context, a stage for how the procession evolves linearly, but also how Dante is able to view it twofold, just as you're saying, either from the edges of the opposite bank or reflected in the very waters that run in front of him.
Right. And this sort of creates an emphasis on movement and forward impetus that really resonates from Dante's poetry and persists throughout its visual afterlives. But even as we have all this movement forward, leading us to Beatrice, the poet surprisingly interrupts the pageant in order to address the reader.
Right, he does. So we have lots of momentum. We're very impatient. We miss Beatrice. We want to get to her. But every now and then, Dante turns his authorial camera away from what he's narrating to how he's able to do so and for whom his poetry is written.
Right. And when Dante speaks directly to the reader, he often calls upon them to carry out some kind of action. He wants his reader to be active, and we get that sense particularly here in this moment in Purgatory.
Right, right. And I wonder if that's not also because of the way that this call to the reader balances not only questions of readership, but also those of authorship. So while Dante's listing all that's in the procession, he gets to those symbols of the four evangelists, but he tells his readers, I'm not going to spend too much time on these figures. A questa non posso essere largo. Because he says, I have other things, I have altra spesa that demand my attention. But he tells his readers, never fear, just go read the book of Ezekiel. Go read this co-author of mine who witnessed the same events, because as you read them in biblical history, so too did I, Dante, the prophetic visionary, experience them here. And this is a really striking moment because we have testimonies from the Bible footnoted in Dante's poem. They're added to a kind of supplemental reading list that will fill in the blanks from the experience that Dante is making the case for in his text.
Exactly. And the choice of Ezekiel is essential, since Ezekiel's book 1, chapter 4 describes, in very similar details, a vision of God and a divine chariot surrounded by the four symbols of the evangelists. So Dante's turn to Ezekiel's authority grounds the Purgatorio pageant within a biblical prophetic tradition. And he does so at a really important point in the procession. Immediately following the call to the reader, we see the griffin and the chariot, the centerpiece and most important part of the pageant. Now, the chariot is empty, but in the next canto, Beatrice will appear and sits atop the chariot. Beatrice, as we know, is the woman whom Dante last saw alive a decade ago in his Vita Nuova, and to whom his 63 previous cantos have led him.
Right, exactly. So this is a very long-awaited moment for sure. But let's just say that for the sake of comparison, we ought to remember that leading up until this moment, this cusp of the reunion between Dante and Beatrice, we encountered references to a few other women who, in multiple ways, represent figures of loss. These women like Persephone and especially Eve, whose ardimento Dante reproaches at the beginning of the canto for it denied not only him, but all humans immortal life in the garden. So if some of the other women thus far have evoked that which has been lost or can be lost, or in the case of Matilda, that which has remained pure, Beatrice embodies not only that which can be lost, but more importantly, that which can be found again.
Right. And Beatrice's arrival in the procession is really what marks a new beginning in Dante's paradisaic journey to reach God. This moment is all about the bonding, reuniting, and progressing collectively, aside from poor Virgil, of course, who must return to limbo. But this is something that modern readers of the poem can certainly still appreciate, since Dante expands here his private journey to include a larger reading community.
Yeah, I really like that summary of this canto as a moment of reunion and a moment of belonging. because I know that the promise of being back together is on many readers' minds these days, and also our own. So I think it's both special and unique that even under the circumstances that we're all facing with this terrible pandemic, a community of readers, a gathering of Dante files can bring the experience of private reading into public spaces such as these and collaborate in ways that we might not have necessarily experimented with before. And as we know, such acts of coming together are essential in times like these for many different reasons, not least, though, because this year, 2021, we get to celebrate the 700th anniversary of the poet's death and the many, many afterlives of his poem and his great legacy. And on that note, I know that we have one final image we wanted to show that illustrates how joyous and harmonious reunions can be and what we all have to look forward to in the rest of the poem.
Yes, and that is Salvador Dali's Purgatorio, the meeting of Dante and Beatrice from 1960. And when we were discussing what image to close with, we both found ourselves very much in awe of how Dali depicts the joining of Dante's and Beatrice's bodies and souls. The way they are united here, their colors bleeding one into the other, is not only striking, but really inspiring. And of course, this looks toward what will come in the following canto for Dante, and hopefully what will come for us in the months ahead. It's truly a moving reminder that we too might be socially distanced now, but we still are brought together through our communal love of and appreciation for Dante and his poetry.
Yeah, that's really lovely. So thank you, Kristen. Like Purgatorio 29, we will end our remarks there, pointing towards this very beautiful moment of reunion and celebration between Dante and his muse, Beatrice. We want to express our sincere gratitude to the project curators of the Canto per Canto web series, the Italian departments at Columbia University and New York University, as well as to the Dante Society of America. For those who have listened, grazie dell'ascolto. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And we are sending everyone all our best wishes for tranquility and very happy reading.
Grazie mille and be well, everyone.